Friends, I want to invite you to start with a word of prayer. Loving God, really it is an honor to be able to gather as colleagues and grapple with ideas, recognizing that you're on the move and trying to lean in on what the Spirit is doing. We pray, God, that you may lead us to a clear understanding on how to reach various groups, specifically here in North America, in our territory. Holy Spirit, we pray that you may move in our conversations, in our minds, in our hearts, and that we may leave this place with a conviction that we have been called and that you have a purpose for us in this work. We pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. My name is Manny Arteaga, and I'm a simple pastor with a tiny biography. And that's perfectly fine. I'm perfectly fine with that. I want to begin today by just briefly telling you a story. 2015, we planted a church in Southern California. This was a church whose purpose was reaching people born in North America in the context of the Latino church. So we went to many conferences and many conventions. We visited many churches and got a lot of really, really good ideas. And when we launched the church, it was standing room only. 40% of our attendants were visitors, unchurched people not connected to any other Adventist church. Tithe and baptisms were steadily growing, and by all metrics, we were deemed a success. But it wasn't long until I learned a lesson, and it's a lesson that stays with me, that just because a church gets larger does not mean the church is growing. Our church was not growing, it was swelling. Healthy things grow. Unhealthy things swell. So there was various issues that we can't get into necessarily, but there's one thing I do want to share, and it was a major crisis of identity that we had as a congregation. We had an identity crisis. Here we are, attempting to reach a second and third generation, and what we started doing is we started checking, watch this, our beautiful, rich, cultural nuances at the door and putting on a culture that was not quite our own. Forsaking that we could be authentically Latino and authentically Christian at the same time. Revelation 7 describes a great multitude before the throne who shows up as every nation, tribe, people, and language. Notice, pastors, how culture is not checked at heaven's door. We don't leave our language at the door. We don't leave the fact that we belong to a people or a nation at the door. Why should we check it at the door of our church? So here we were. We had beautiful brown families raising beautiful brown babies who would grow up knowing nothing about Más Allá del Sol. Entire generations who would be raised missing out on the theological richness of the simplicity of Coritos, never hearing about God's omnipresence through Dios está aquí or God's redemptive grace through that beautiful song, Renuévame. Not learning to appreciate the richness of abuelita theology. So this is how we realized it. Once the hype of being a church plant wore off, because it does wear off, we began to notice one thing. Who we were in the worship center and who we were in the halls were two different churches. The worship center was a veggie version of Hillsong, but in the halls and around the table, we weren't family. We were familia. We were Spanglish. Our culturas were alive and well outside the worship center because they were alive and well inside of us. So here we are attempting to reach the second and third generation. What we actually did was create a disconnect. And this is when we realized, watch this, that who we were on the inside of the worship space was actually suppressing who we were on the inside of ourselves. Two different churches. Inside the worship space, one culture, but out here, in la mesa, at the table, in the halls, we were a Spanglish, multi-generational familia made up of Latina cultures bound together by the love of Christ. We call ourselves Café con Fe, brown with faith. Our biggest mistake was that while we were hungry and eager to meet the need when we planted the church, we wanted to reach people born in North America, we really didn't understand what that meant. We didn't understand what the need was or the context that we would be working under. So we assumed, our mistake was, we assumed we knew what this demographic needed. Oh, they must not want anything to do with their Latinidad. They must not want anything to do with the Hispanic work. I mean, they left the Hispanic churches for a reason, right? They may not want anything to do with the language or the culture. So we started divorcing ourselves from the very thing that was ingrained in all of us. We assumed our church wanted to be a certain kind of church. So what we ended up doing was we ended up forcing things on a community that needed something completely different. And friends, that's the risk we run when we come to conventions and conferences. We get ideas. There's a lot of good ideas. There's a lot of good concepts and good programs and good practices, right? We get ideas. We try to copy and paste it. We try to implement these ideas, assuming that that is what our context needs. And then we become frustrated because the ideas don't work. So today I want to share briefly in the next few minutes a little rubric that is actually rooted or grounded in the hermeneutical circle by Eldon Villafane from Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary. He describes it as three different pieces, and I'm not going to use necessarily his language. I'm going to modify it. His language is he begins with clarification, moves on to conceptualization, and then ends with what he calls confrontation. But for the sake of our conversation, I want to adapt these three pieces using the following language: context, theology, and praxis. You see, we usually come to these spaces and we come for praxis. And I want to believe that there's some people in the room who came to get some ideas on how to reach people born in North America. We come for ideas. What is such and such church doing? What is that congregation doing? Let's look at the programs. Let's look at the initiatives. What curriculum are they teaching? Ideas. We come for the praxis, and we often go and copy and paste what someone else is doing and force it into a context. We get an idea, we say it's working for them, I'm gonna try it. And maybe, just maybe, we'll screen it through our theological lens, our theological filter, make sure that it's Adventist enough for us to even implement. We copy and paste it and hope that it works. And that's what we did. We got some really cool ideas, but what we ended up doing, we created a problem of identity, and we were not our authentic selves as a congregation. You see, our paradigm began with praxis. We screened it through theology and applied it into our context. What order should we follow when we consider these three things? See, we often start with praxis, but could it be, some may say, could it be that we should be starting with theology? I mean, we're big on theology. We're big on doctrine as Adventists, and we have a robust theology in Adventism. Could it be that we're supposed to be starting with theology? Well, let's say we do start with theology, which we do often as Adventists. We come with our big theological ideas to spaces where they don't always land as we hope for them to land. I mean, come on, friends. Have you noticed how often we as Adventists try to scratch an itch that isn't even there? Or how often we are answering questions that no one is asking. Could it be that we need to rethink the way we structure these things? So what Eldon Villafana is actually suggesting is that we must begin with context. We must begin with context. What do we mean? Well, let me explain. We start by clarifying the context. What is our context? I mean, the title for this talk is Reaching People Born in North America. Friends, let me tell you, I'm going to be very honest with you. I have no idea what the title even means. What do we mean by people born in North America? What are we referring to? We're not talking about a monolith group. Are we referring to Korean Americans, Armenian Americans, Salvadoran Americans? Because every single group that we could possibly name needs to be met in a particular way. This is not a monolith. So if we really want to implement practical ways to reach, we need to understand what is our context in the first place. Who are we talking about? What is their story? What issues are we hoping to address? What are their needs? And there are surveys. And friends, we got to do a lot of pastoral listening to truly understand who we're trying to serve. Rather than just coming to conferences, getting inspired, bringing cool ideas, trying to force them into a context that may not necessarily be ready to receive them. So let's say, just for illustration purposes, let's say that I do a survey in my context. I do a survey in my context and I discover that my context is young families living in an urban setting, watch this, most of which are on the verge of burnout. That is my context. Let's use that for illustration purposes. My context is young families in an urban setting, most of who are on the verge of burnout. Watch this. We've identified the context. Now we move to theology. And tell me, friends, what do I, as an Adventist church, what do I possibly have in my theological repertoire to offer a demographic, a community that is on the verge of burnout? What do I have theologically? In my theological library as an Adventist, what do I have to offer a demographic that is tired, that lives in an urban setting, that has to be putting up with all the traffic and the commute of LA and are burned out? What could I possibly offer a demographic like this? Well, how about the Sabbath? I mean, as I look at my theological repertoire, the Sabbath stands out, and it could come in as a gift to a community that is needing to experience rest. Or imagine if my analysis showed that my community, my neighborhood shows high rates of depression and anxiety or poor stress management. Could it be that the Adventist church could then look at our theological library and realize, I have a health message to offer a community that is just spent because of all the stress and the anxiety and the burnout? You see, we began by understanding who we're trying to serve, and then we look at this beautiful, robust Adventist theology, and we will see that we have a whole lot to offer to our communities. But now we know what they need. So then we move to praxis. We move to ministries, we move to programs, we move to initiatives, we move to practical ideas, right? This is where we can create wellness workshops and psychoeducational talks about relational and mental health. I mean, we have a Sabbath message. As a church, friends, we ought to be at the forefront of our conversations on justice and equality. Why? Because our Sabbath doctrine is so robust, and the Sabbath message biblically is so holistic that we ought to be leading from there. We have so much in our theology, but we need to understand who and what we're trying to service, the needs that we're trying to meet in the first place. So what he suggests is that we get to know our context. We begin by knowing our context, really understanding who we're trying to serve. We then look at our beautiful, robust theological library as Christian Seventh-day Adventists. And then the ideas begin to flow. Maybe this is what we need. This is how we can present the Sabbath message. This is how we can present the health message. This is how we can now introduce different theological ideas in a practical way for a context that needs it. The possibilities are endless. So, our church is not perfect. We are still very much recovering from a pandemic that whooped our behind. We still have some leadership issues to resolve. But here's something we did over the last couple years. We listened. We listened, and now who we are in the worship center is the same church that we are in the hallways and around the table. We are Café con Fe. We may sing Maverick City music, but we sprinkle a little bit of habanero sauce on top of that. Our children worship him as Jesus and Jesus. Our greatest theologians, in many ways, are our abuelitas. Our food continues to be our food. We are not a church family, we're a familia. Coritos shape our spirituality. We are de aquí y de allá. And friends, let me tell you something. It's messy. It's a liminal space. It's always changing, but it's who we are. And it's beautiful. Thank you.
So, Manny, you shared some powerful stuff there. And what resonated with me is it's so practical. You're kind of pulling away the curtain and you're saying this is how we got where we're at, to see that movement. And you also gave us a rubric to start our discussion and putting our arms around the topic and what our title is. And so we move from your presentation to a panel discussion to be able to start kind of unpacking it. So we're going to have a panel discussion for a little bit, and then we'll open it up for the questions that you have that you would like to address to our panel along with our topic. So it feels like the appropriate place to begin is to follow along with your rubric and to share. You've shared your context, but we have two panelists who are joining you. What is your context for ministry?
I am on the road a lot, and so my primary context for ministry would be African Americans, college community. I'm in Huntsville, Alabama. But when I'm on the road, it's largely the same. The educational levels might change a bit, but it's fairly monolithic, and for that reason, it's probably not as challenging to get to some of the questions and answers about reaching anybody that a presentation like this might ask for. I think that what Manny said was great. Context, let me put it this way. It's absolutely true that we need to be as efficient in exegeting our culture and those neighborhoods that we find ourselves placed in as we would a text. But I think the commonalities are a lot more consistent, especially in North America. I get the challenge that we have trying to address a title like that, but I think that the pandemic, trauma, and certain flashpoints in North America have kind of brought us together in some interesting ways. Your point about the gift of Adventism to answer some of the issues of the day, I think, well said. To a culture that's traumatized and stressed, the Sabbath, rightly understood, is a godsend. There are two other issues that I think always resonate. One would be family and one would be health. And so to the extent that we can kind of contextualize it to where we are, the more effective we would be. But I do think that even though we differ widely in cultural expressions, there's some common issues that if we paid attention to them, that little plumb line could help us reach our communities.
Thanks. So my context, I guess, if we're going to exegete that, is a little bit all across the continuum. We've got churches in Redlands, California, big Adventist Mecca, right? We've so some resources there that we're able to have. Church out in Clinton, Massachusetts, which is a very, very different context. Downtown LA in the Arts District, we've been planting that church for 3 years. Portland, Oregon, and then Chattanooga, Tennessee, as well as a group in not Lovewell. We call it Lovewell, in Woodlands, Texas, and a couple other groups outside of the country. So, so there's a complexity to our context. Where I work each week, preaching from Redlands, not monolithic by any means. It's one of the most diverse churches I've ever been to. A lot of second and third generation that have come and found, meaning and value within our context. But yet, I do know that when they're finished with church with us, they're going to go back to the Indonesian church and have potluck, which is a blessing because it's a good potluck. And ours isn't very good. We don't have one. So yeah, I understand what you're saying. I think exegeting that context is important. I have a tendency to resonate a little bit with Dr. Wilson as well. I've always, as we began planning churches, one of the things that we wanted to make sure we got straight was kind of going by the rubric that Frost and Hirsch put together in their book, The Shaping of Things to Come, which is a little bit older now at this point, where they said you kind of have to sort out your Christology, and your Christology then will inform your missiology, and your missiology then will inform your ecclesiology. And that's always been very helpful rubric for me, especially now as we kind of transcend a monolithic culture, if you will, in every area. And by the way, you'll never have more fun than mentioning something like the Second Amendment with a church in Portland, Oregon, Redlands, California, and Tennessee. They don't all have the same ears. No, by any means, I found out. So yeah, I would say I'm trying to thread a needle from across the room most of the time. And that's our context.
So these are different contexts. So you speak from each of the places that you're at. My next question would be, you've shared your context, and Tim, you started answering this question. I wanted you to push back on the rubric, because what Manny had the courage to do was to just kind of say, this is the structure, this is the process we go through. But you started to say, okay, so I've looked at one that's just a little different from a different angle. So would you expand on that, and then we'll give Manny the opportunity to kind of give a reference point to how he arrived where he was.
Sorry. Yeah, that rubric, the Christology to missiology to ecclesiology, has been helpful as we've really tried to build infrastructure for people, right? We're not trying to necessarily go plant the same church over and over, but there are some DNA things that we would like to see expressed. Jesus is a central focus as the message and the messenger of that thing. Language, branding, all that sort of thing helps accelerate a church plant, if you will. And then after we kind of help that initial stage, what begins to happen is we begin to exegete that context and really feel like, okay, well, who showed up and who's actually here? Because in any church plant, people come and they check it out and they're there for a little while, and they're just tourists. I mean, they're not even getting hotel rooms. They're just walking by. And so so once you figure out who your core is, then that begins to shift. I had hoped that was something that could happen before. In our practice, I guess you would say, you kind of have to build, for us, it's maybe not right for anyone else, sort of have to build that infrastructure and see who shows up and then who remains. And then we begin to see the real cultural expression begin to show up. Now that's different because we don't have, we're not language based, which I think makes a big difference. It makes a big difference. And so we're looking in Redlands to start a Spanish ministry, Crosswalk en Español, and that's been a really interesting discussion. Been asked for the last 7 years, we want to do Crosswalk in Spanish, then we sit down and it's very different what the expression they're really kind of looking for, but yet they still want that too. And so, I'm kind of standing on the outside saying, okay, inform me so we can make sure that we're building what is relevant, what is needed. But we've already had some of that DNA, and the theology can't change from a sense of the focus on Jesus, because that's just kind of our thing and where we are. So,
Absolutely. I think part of the exegeting your context, it's not devoid of theology, right? There's a sense in when you exegete a context, you're leaning in on what the Spirit has been doing in that context all along. Oftentimes, you plant a church in a community, and you think you're bringing Jesus, right? You think you're the one bringing the Spirit to the community, not realizing that there's been a pastor there for 35 years that has been fighting for civil rights, that has been visiting, members of the community. That's part of exegeting includes, obviously, the move of the Spirit. That's why I was saying, who are we trying to serve? What is the story? It's not removing that component. But it is important for us. We see this oftentimes in big cities where we have major churches kind of coming in and planting. We see that a lot in LA. A lot of the big evangelical churches come in, and they almost come in as saviors to a community, ignoring the fact that the Spirit has been on the move far before they ever arrived. So part of that discernment has to do with leaning into what the Spirit is doing. The reason I presented this rubric is more, how do we reach the praxis? That's a question I'm trying to ask. How do we reach the praxis? Let's not take the shortcuts and go straight to praxis. Let's understand what we're dealing with, who we're dealing with, our context. Look at our beautiful theology, see how we can apply that in a practical way.
Yeah, a very wise theologian once said in a class that I took that when you go to a church, you're joining a work in progress. You're not starting it, you're joining what God is already doing. And so it's neat for me to hear from your perspective. You're doing looking at a lot of church plants. You're still joining a work that God already has in progress. And for you to call that out is encouraging. And so, Dr. Wilson, in your context, what does this look like? Joining God's work in progress.
Let me back up a bit. I think that let's talk about what's missing from Adventist evangelism and outreach. I think what's fundamentally missing from Adventist outreach is Adventists, frankly. Whether you're planning a church or whether you're dealing with a traditional church, this idea of members being so activated by the gospel that they're inclined to share, not as full-time Bible workers, but witnesses, not expert witnesses, but material witnesses. People that speak out of an overflow is what's missing from evangelism, from my perspective. And so it doesn't really matter what the model is. A lot of what we do in the absence of active members. And I think that flows from a couple of things. The most discouraging thing for me as a college professor would be the number of my students who come from Adventist homes who really have no real sense of what the gospel means. And so when you talk about evangelism, whether you're planting a church, whether you're expanding a church, you cannot share the gospel if the good news is not good to you, period. Right. And so doubling down on Christology to the extent that people really understand the implications of the gospel is full stop for us everywhere we go, because it's really our only hope in broadening the, quote, witnesses so that they can get into the field. And they are much better able to explain and to understand and to reach the culture that we find our plants or legacy churches or whatever the church might be. That's been my experience.
Just the fact that you're able to distill it down to this is where you're full stop. So I just want to hear, do you each have a full stop? Is it the same?
I mean, if our answer is not the same one, what are we doing? Right? Let's just close the doors of our church. If Christ is the full stop, and I think we agree across the board, right? That's our full stop. I don't think that's what's at stake here, what's being discussed here. It's, I think at various levels, we're just trying to grapple with how it is that we reach to our ecclesiology, but our full stop hasn't changed.
Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, did you want to add to that, or are you just going to say ditto? Here, hand it to
I
him.
was going to say Jesus full stop all, but I've been part of an organization that's been saying that for the last 12 years.
Absolutely.
So, let me say one thing. Okay, so you laughed because you're like, okay, so he just said our full stop, and I get that. But what I needed to hear was just that echo, because sometimes it gets so complicated. Okay, what do I need to know? How do I walk out with this rubric? What do I do? But what each of you have, even while you have different contexts, is you have a shared full stop. And I think for us to be able to call that out, it gives us that foundation of where do we start? What is the non-negotiable? So yes, a little bit of a laugh, but thank you for going with me along on that. Because what you're doing is expressing that full stop inside of a different context. You have, look out here, you see all those who have chosen to dedicate part of their called experience to coming here to have this conversation. So you've expressed your context. What are some principles? So that you don't want them to walk out and just try to do exactly what you do. But what are the principles that they should take with them as they express the same full stop?
I think if you look at what we're faced with in North America, everything has changed. And so as a missiologist, as an evangelist, as a witness, as a church leader, I think flexibility is a non-negotiable these days, because you make a plan on Tuesday, it's going to be irrelevant on Wednesday. And so you need to know how to get to the same place in two different directions. When I was pastoring in California, I use this illustration. I had tickets for the Clippers games at Staples Center. But because of the traffic in and I was living in Riverside, exactly. It was an hour and a half drive that could extend to 3 hours. But because I was not going to take the train, but I wasn't going to waste my money, I could get to the Staples Center down 91, 60, 210, and down. My point is, I had a number of different ways to get to the same destination. And if we're going to be effective these days in reaching our communities, we're going to have firm principles, but our practices are going to have to be very flexible. That's been my experience.
Sure. I don't know if it was it Mike Tyson who said everybody's got a game plan until they get punched in the face? That's ministry, right? That's ministry. And so I think the conditioning is really important, right? The conditioning that we do theologically, the conditioning that we do discipline-wise, from ourselves, from the people that are gonna be part of that ministry with us. There's a consistency, there's a training, there's a, not to elongate the sports metaphor, I apologize, but I think that really matters, because you're going to walk into any context, and it's going to shift and it's going to morph, because it's human nature at the end of the day. But I think that the hope that we are consistently offering and sharing and really inviting people into, I think that hope is what people need and what people want. And I think that transcends a lot of cultural differences, a lot of generational differences, a lot of language differences. Everybody's got a different name or a different word for the word hope, but we all know that we need it. And when that hope is what's offered, I think consistently, biblically, I think that's a really important part of it. We are Christians. We have an authoritative book that we need to delve into deeply, not topically, but expositionally. I think when we preach like that week after week, and people know they can walk into our spaces, they can hear what we are for, not what we're against, and they can feel the hope that we have been given and that we are willing to share. We don't have an evangelism strategy. I remember somebody came by sometime and said, "Oh, your churches are growing. What's your evangelism strategy?" And we kind of sat around going, "Do we have We're going to do church really well. We're going to do church in a way that won't embarrass you, that you can bring a friend to, and they won't hear something against them. They won't hear something against their background. They won't hear hate coming from the pulpit. They'll just hear hope. They'll hear grace. They'll hear love, and they will be treated as such. So we create an experience that circles around that message of hope so that they feel it. At the end of the day, I think that's why, at least in our experience, that's why you go to one of our churches and it's not monolithic. It's because anyone who walks in says, this does feel like home, even though it may not speak the same language as my home, and that sort of thing. And that's what that's what I think all of us hope to give. But I think there's a consistency to that, and unfortunately, there is a courage in that is, it's harder to do. It's harder to do than we think because of the nature of humanity, the nature of institutions, the nature sometimes of the church. Everything wants to distract you from what you're supposed to be doing. And I'm not going to say any more because I'm talking about this tonight at 9. So I'm not going to put language to it. So hopefully that's a teaser maybe.
Word that comes up for me is commitment. In a polarized world, where church pulls you in different directions on issues, having a cruciform lens through everything you do, for everything you do, Christ crucified as your true north, and that's how you engage social issues and whatnot. That has been my biggest challenge. At the same time, my biggest anchor. It won't make you popular. It'll get you a lot of enemies in the process. But faithfulness, that commitment. Yeah.
Let me say this, Heather. What Manny mentioned about commitment is also another challenge for most churches. And I think what makes commitment a challenge is, when you're talking about commitment, it's the language of discipleship. One of the things that's been very encouraging to me with the younger students is that there seems to be a hunger now for deeper theology. They're more radical in their faith. They obviously got sick of cool church in their different contexts. And so the very things that used to challenge them and they would not stand around or stay around to hear are the very things that are motivating them. I see a real revival among the teens. And it's that kind of silver lining, because I think what has been missing, certainly been missing in my churches, is a real commitment to discipleship. The whole cliche, we're not making members, we're making disciples. I don't want to get into that. I'm just saying a clear idea of expectations beyond requirements. I'm seeing more of a hunger for that, and I'm encouraged.
So you've heard their takeaways, you've heard some of this. Do you have some questions that you want to ask? The best way to say you have a question, yes, is raise your hand, and so we can recognize we only have one microphone. So you'll have to use your preacher voice. Okay, please.
So I thank you for your talk. I think we all appreciate what you're saying. There's a reality in the North American division, and that reality is that pastors stay in any given church from 2 to 5 years tops, and then we switch around. And then the circumstances are switching all the time. So if we're to exegete the context and create a plan, by the time the plan is executed, we're not there. So help us understand maybe what you've done in the past. I know some of you have been in your position for a little longer than 5 years, or 3 years, but you were in that position where you were shifted around before. So what is something that we can do for those that are shifted around to